The dust rose in thick clouds behind the broken wheel as Julia Zimmerman stared at the wreckage of her life scattered across the Montana Territory ground, knowing that without help she would die out here alone. She had been traveling for 3 weeks from St. Louis, heading west with her late husband's brother and his wife, seeking a fresh start in the goldfields near Virginia City. But 2 days ago, everything had gone wrong. Her brother-in-law had accused her of stealing from their shared supplies, a lie born from his desire to take her portion of the inheritance her husband had left her. The argument had turned violent when his wife joined in, and Julia had fled in the night with one of the wagons, taking only what was rightfully hers. She had thought she could make it to the next town alone. She had studied the maps, rationed her water carefully, and kept the horse moving at a steady pace. But yesterday, the wagon wheel had hit a hidden ravine, splintering beyond repair. The horse had broken free in the chaos and run off into the wilderness. Now she sat beside the wreckage in the scorching August heat of 1875, her water nearly gone, watching vultures circle overhead. Julia was 22 years old, a widow of 6 months, and she refused to die here. She stood up, brushing the dust from her dark blue traveling dress, and began sorting through what she could carry. Her hands trembled as she worked, but she forced herself to stay calm. Panic would kill her faster than thirst. The sound of hoofbeats made her freeze. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she straightened, shading her eyes against the brutal sun. A single rider approached from the east, moving at an easy canter. As he drew closer, she could make out a tall figure on a paint horse, wearing a dusty brown hat and a dark vest over a worn shirt. Julia's hand moved instinctively to the small pistol she kept in her pocket. She was alone and vulnerable. Any man could mean danger out here in the wilderness where no laws reached. The rider slowed as he approached, raising one hand in a gesture of peace. "Easy there," he called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "I am not here to cause trouble." He stopped his horse about 20 feet away, giving her space. Julia could see him more clearly now. He was perhaps 25 or 26, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at the edges beneath his hat. His face was lean and angular, marked by several days of stubble, and his eyes were a striking shade of green that seemed out of place in his weathered face. "Looks like you have had some trouble," he said, nodding toward the broken wagon. His voice was deeper than she expected, with a slight drawl that marked him as someone who had spent time in the Southern Territories. "The wheel broke," Julia said, keeping her voice steady. "I can manage." The cowboy looked at the scattered supplies, the broken wheel, the empty horizon in all directions. Then he looked back at her, and something like concern crossed his features. "Madam, with respect, you cannot manage. Not out here. The next town is 40 miles north, and the sun will cook you long before you walk even half that distance." "I will be fine," Julia insisted, though even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. The cowboy's eyes were kind but realistic, and she could see he knew it too. He dismounted slowly, keeping his movements careful and non-threatening. Up close, he was taller than she had realized, perhaps 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscular build of someone who spent his life working outdoors. "My name is James Peterson," he said. "I work for the Triple Bar Ranch about 15 miles northwest of here. I was riding fence line when I saw your wagon from the ridge." "Julia Zimmerman," she replied automatically, then immediately regretted giving her real name. But something about his straightforward manner made her feel that honesty was safer than deception. James looked at the wagon again, then back at her. "Mrs. Zimmerman, I do not mean to frighten you, but you need to understand the situation. You have maybe half a canteen of water left. The temperature is over 90 degrees. There are wolves and mountain lions in these hills, and they get bolder at night. You cannot stay here, and you cannot walk to safety." Julia felt her throat tighten. She had been trying not to think about the night, about what would happen when darkness fell. "What are you suggesting?" "Climb on," James said, gesturing to his horse. "I know a place where you will be welcome. The Triple Bar is run by a good man named Samuel Hartford. His wife Margaret keeps a boarding house for travelers and ranch hands. They will give you a room and a hot meal, no questions asked. Once you are rested, we can figure out how to get you where you are going." Julia hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to be cautious. She knew nothing about this man except what he had told her. He could be lying about everything. He could be leading her into worse danger. But as she looked at the broken wagon, felt the sun beating down mercilessly on her head, and heard the lonely cry of a hawk overhead, she knew she had no real choice. Pride would not keep her alive. Stubbornness would not save her from exposure or predators. "How do I know I can trust you?" she asked quietly. James met her eyes directly. "You do not," he said honestly, "but I give you my word that no harm will come to you under my protection. The Hartfords are good people, and there are women at the ranch who will make sure you are safe. If you want to leave after one night, I will personally escort you to Bozeman, Montana, and make sure you get on a stage headed wherever you want to go." Something in his voice, in the steady way he looked at her, made Julia believe him. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was instinct, but she found herself nodding. "All right, thank you." Relief flickered across James's face. "We should take what we can carry. Do you have anything particularly valuable or necessary?" Together they sorted through her belongings. Julia took her small trunk of clothes, her husband's pocket watch that she kept as a memento, a leather pouch with her money and papers, and a few personal items. James tied the trunk securely behind his saddle and helped her pack a saddlebag with the rest. "I am sorry about the wagon," he said as he worked. "Were you traveling alone?" Julia hesitated, then decided there was no point in lying. "I was traveling with family, but we had a disagreement. I took what was mine and left." James glanced at her, and she saw understanding in his eyes rather than judgment. "Family can be complicated," he said simply. When everything was secured, James mounted his horse and then reached down to help Julia up. She placed her foot in the stirrup and grasped his hand, feeling the calloused strength in his grip as he pulled her up behind him. She settled onto the horse's back, acutely aware of how close she was to this stranger, how she had to hold onto his waist to keep her balance. "Ready?" James asked over his shoulder. "Yes," Julia said, and they rode away from the broken wagon, leaving it behind like a discarded memory in the vast Montana wilderness. The ride to the Triple Bar took nearly 2 hours. At first, Julia sat stiffly behind James, holding on to him as lightly as possible while still maintaining her balance. But as the horse moved beneath them with a steady, rocking gait, she gradually relaxed. James rode with easy confidence, guiding the paint horse over rough terrain without hesitation. "How long have you worked at the Triple Bar?" Julia asked after a while, partly to distract herself from her thirst and partly because the silence felt heavy. 3 years, James replied. "I came up from Texas after the war, worked my way through Colorado and Wyoming doing cattle drives and ranch work. When I got to Montana, Samuel Hartford offered me a permanent position. It is good work, honest work." "You were in the war?" Julia asked quietly. "Too young to fight," James said. "But I saw the aftermath. My father and both my brothers died at Shiloh. My mother passed a year later. After that, there was nothing keeping me in Texas, so I headed west like everyone else looking for a fresh start." "I am sorry," Julia said, meaning it. She knew about loss, about the weight of grief that never quite lifted. It was a long time ago, James said, though his voice carried a note of old sadness. What about you? Were you heading to Virginia City, originally? Julia admitted. My husband died in a riverboat accident 6 months ago. His brother convinced me to come west with him and his wife, said we could start a mining operation together with the inheritance money. But it turned out he just wanted my share of the money for himself. When I refused to sign it over to him, things got ugly. James was quiet for a moment. That is a hard thing to face from family. They were never really my family, Julia said. My husband was kind, but his brother always resented him. I think he resented me too. After Thomas died, I should have seen it coming. You cannot blame yourself for trusting people, James said. That says more about them than it does about you. The simple kindness in his words made Julia's eyes sting with unexpected tears. She blinked them back quickly, refusing to cry in front of this stranger who had shown her more compassion in 2 hours than her brother-in-law had shown in months. As they rode, the landscape gradually changed. The barren, rocky terrain gave way to rolling grassland dotted with cottonwood trees. In the distance, Julia could see mountains rising against the blue sky, their peaks still touched with snow despite the summer heat. A creek appeared, running clear and cold through a shallow valley, and James stopped to let the horse drink and to refill Julia's canteen. We are almost there, he said, pointing to a cluster of buildings visible in the distance. That is the Triple Bar. The ranch was larger than Julia had expected. The main house was a 2-story structure built of timber and stone, with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Behind it stood a large barn, several outbuildings, a bunkhouse, and what looked like a separate boarding house. Cattle grazed in fenced pastures, and she could see several men working near the corrals. As they rode into the ranch yard, a woman emerged from the main house, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. She was in her 40s, with graying brown hair pinned up in a practical bun, and a kind face marked by laugh lines. James Peterson, who have you brought us? She called out, her voice warm with curiosity rather than suspicion. James dismounted and then helped Julia down. Her legs were shaky after the long ride and she stumbled slightly. James steadied her with a hand on her elbow, his touch gentle. Mrs. Hartford, this is Julia Zimmerman. I found her stranded about 15 miles south. Her wagon broke down and she needs a place to stay. Margaret Hartford came down the porch steps, her eyes taking in Julia's dusty dress, her sun-burned face and her exhausted posture. Without hesitation, she put an arm around Julia's shoulders. You poor dear, you look half dead from heat and worry. Come inside right now. James, bring her things to the blue room. And get Samuel, he will want to know we have a guest. Before Julia could protest or even properly thank James, she found herself swept into the cool interior of the house. Margaret Hartford moved with brisk efficiency, guiding her to a comfortable parlor and pressing a glass of cool water into her hands. Drink slowly, Margaret instructed. I know you are thirsty, but too much too fast will make you sick. Now tell me what happened while I get you something to eat. Over the next hour, Julia found herself telling the whole story to Margaret Hartford while eating fresh bread, cold roast beef, and the best apple pie she had ever tasted. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression growing more sympathetic as the story unfolded. That brother-in-law of yours should be horsewhipped, Margaret said when Julia finished. Treating a widow that way, trying to steal what is rightfully yours. But you are safe here, dear. You can stay as long as you need. I do not want to impose, Julia began, but Margaret waved her hand dismissively. Nonsense. We run this place partly as a ranch and partly as a boarding house for travelers. You will earn your keep if it makes you feel better. I can always use help in the kitchen and garden. But first, you need rest. Let me show you to your room." The blue room was simple but clean, with whitewashed walls, a comfortable bed covered in a blue and white quilt, and a window that looked out over the pastures. Julia's trunk sat at the foot of the bed, and someone had filled the wash basin with fresh water. "There are clean towels in the drawer," Margaret said. "Rest as long as you need. Supper is at 6, but if you are sleeping, I will save you a plate." After Margaret left, Julia locked the door and finally allowed herself to break down. She sank onto the bed and wept, releasing all the fear and stress and grief she had been holding back. She cried for her dead husband, for her shattered plans, for the terrifying hours beside the broken wagon when she had been certain she would die. She cried until she had no tears left, and then she washed her face, changed into a clean dress, and lay down on the bed. She intended to rest for just a few minutes, but exhaustion claimed her immediately, and she slept through the afternoon and evening, not waking until the next morning when sunlight streamed through the window. For a moment, Julia could not remember where she was. Then memory returned, and with it came a sense of profound relief. She was alive. She was safe, and she had been helped by a stranger who had expected nothing in return. After washing and dressing, Julia made her way downstairs. She could hear voices from the kitchen and followed the sound. Margaret was at the stove, cooking eggs and bacon while a young woman with red hair set the table. "Good morning," Julia said hesitantly from the doorway. Margaret turned with a bright smile. "There you are. I thought you might sleep until noon. Come sit down, breakfast is almost ready." "This is Annie, my niece. She helps me run the boarding house." Annie smiled warmly at Julia. "Nice to meet you proper. I saw James bring you in yesterday, but you looked dead on your feet." As Julia sat down, Margaret placed a full plate in front of her. "Eat up. You need to get your strength back." Julia had just started eating when heavy footsteps sounded on the porch and the door opened. James Peterson walked in, removing his hat. His eyes went immediately to Julia, and something like relief crossed his face. "You are awake," he said. "I was worried about you." "Thanks to you," Julia said, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. In the clear morning light, she could see James more clearly than she had yesterday. He had cleaned up since then, his face freshly shaved, his dark hair damp as though he had just washed. He was handsome in a rugged, unpretentious way that made her heart flutter unexpectedly. "Just doing what anyone should do," James said, but his eyes lingered on her face a moment longer than necessary before he turned to Margaret. "Is there extra?" "I have been mending fence since dawn, and I am starving." "Sit down, you know there is always enough," Margaret said, already preparing another plate. James sat across from Julia, and for a while they ate in comfortable silence. Then Samuel Hartford came in, a weathered man in his 50s with gray in his beard and a commanding presence. James introduced Julia, and Samuel welcomed her with the same warmth his wife had shown. "Stay as long as you need," Samuel said. "And if you need help getting your belongings back from that brother-in-law of yours, I know the sheriff in Bozeman. He is a fair man who does not take kindly to people cheating widows." Julia felt tears prick her eyes again at the unexpected kindness. "Thank you, all of you. I do not know how to repay you." "You do not need to repay kindness," Margaret said firmly, "but if you want to help out while you are here, I will not say no. Can you cook?" "Yes, and I can sew, keep accounts, and manage a household," Julia said. "My mother taught me well." "Then we will put you to work," Margaret said with satisfaction. "But not today. Today you rest and get your bearings." After breakfast, James stood to leave. "I need to get back to work, but if you need anything, Mrs. Zimmerman, just ask Margaret. She runs this place more than Samuel does, though do not tell him I said so." Samuel laughed. "I heard that, and it is the truth. My wife is the real boss here." James paused at the door, looking back at Julia. "I am glad you are all right," he said quietly, and then he was gone. Over the following days, Julia settled into life at the Triple Bar Ranch. She helped Margaret in the kitchen, learning to cook for the dozen ranch hands who worked the property. She mended clothes, kept the accounts, and worked in the garden. The physical work was harder than anything she had done in St. Louis, but it felt good to be useful, to be too busy to dwell on her troubles. She saw James every day at meals, and sometimes in passing around the ranch. He was always polite, always respectful, but Julia found herself watching for him, listening for his voice. There was something solid and steady about him that made her feel safe. He never pushed or pried, but when they talked, he listened carefully to what she said, as though her words mattered to him. 10 days after Julia arrived at the ranch, Samuel made a trip into Bozeman and returned with news. He had spoken to the sheriff, and they had located Julia's brother-in-law and his wife at a hotel in town. When confronted, they had initially denied having any of Julia's belongings, but the sheriff had persuaded them to turn over what they had taken. "The sheriff has your things in his office," Samuel told Julia. "He also made it clear to your brother-in-law that if he comes near you again, he will spend time in jail." They left on the morning stage, heading back east. Relief washed through Julia. "Thank you, Samuel. I cannot tell you what this means to me." "James is riding into town tomorrow for supplies," Samuel said. "He can escort you if you want to collect your things and speak to the sheriff yourself." The next morning, Julia dressed carefully in her best traveling dress and bonnet. When she came downstairs, James was waiting with a wagon hitched and ready. He helped her up onto the seat, and they set out for Bozeman. The town was about 20 miles from the ranch, a bustling settlement that served as a supply hub for the surrounding ranches and mining operations. As they rode, James pointed out landmarks and told her about the area. "Montana became a territory in 1864, he said. "Bozeman was founded a couple of years before that. It has grown a lot in the last 10 years. There is talk it might become the territorial capital someday." "Have you thought about staying here permanently?" Julia asked. "Or do you plan to keep moving west?" James was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the reins. "I have been drifting for a long time," he said finally. "But the Triple Bar feels like home in a way nowhere else has since I left Texas. Samuel and Margaret treat me like family. The work is good and the land is beautiful. I think maybe I have finished running." There was something wistful in his voice that made Julia look at him more closely. "What were you running from?" "Ghosts, mostly," James said. "Memories of the war, of my family, of the person I used to be. When you lose everything, it is easier to keep moving than to stand still and face what is gone. But lately, I have been thinking that running does not make the ghosts go away. It just means you face them alone." Julia understood that better than she could say. "I have been running too," she admitted. "From grief, from loneliness, from the fear of building a life only to lose it again. When Thomas died, I felt like my whole future died with him. His brother's offer seemed like a chance to start over, but I think I was just exchanging one form of running for another." "And now?" James asked, glancing at her. "Now I do not know," Julia said honestly. "But for the first time in months, I feel like maybe standing still would not be so terrible." They rode in thoughtful silence for a while, and Julia found herself intensely aware of James's presence beside her. She noticed small things she had not paid attention to before. The way he handled the horses with gentle confidence, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon out of habit, the small scar on his left hand that looked like it came from a rope burn. When they reached Bozeman, James helped her down from the wagon and escorted her to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Tom Morrison was a grizzled man in his 50s who treated Julia with gruff kindness. "Your belongings are all here, Mrs. Zimmerman," he said, gesturing to several trunks and bags in the corner. "Your brother-in-law was not happy about returning them, but I made it clear he had no choice. I also made sure he understood that if he spreads any lies about you or tries to make trouble, he will answer to me." "Thank you, Sheriff," Julia said, feeling another wave of gratitude for the kindness of these Montana strangers. "James, can you load these into your wagon?" the sheriff asked. Then he turned back to Julia. "If you do not mind me asking, what are your plans now? Are you staying in the territory or heading back east?" Julia hesitated. The truth was, she had been avoiding thinking about the future. "I have not decided yet." "Well, if you decide to stay, you should know that good people are always welcome here," the sheriff said. "This territory is rough in some ways, but we take care of our own. And from what I hear, you have made a good impression at the Triple Bar." After loading Julia's belongings, James suggested they get lunch before heading back. They went to a small restaurant on Main Street, where James was greeted by several people who clearly knew him. He introduced Julia simply as a friend staying at the ranch, and no one pried or asked uncomfortable questions. Over lunch, they talked about everything and nothing. James told her about learning to rope cattle, about the time a horse threw him into a creek, about the spectacular sunsets over the mountains. Julia found herself laughing more than she had in months, feeling lighter than she could remember. "You have a beautiful laugh," James said suddenly, then looked surprised that he had spoken the words aloud. Julia felt her cheeks warm. "I have not had much to laugh about lately." "Then I am glad I could change that," James said, his green eyes serious. "You deserve to be happy, Julia." The way he said her name, without the formal Mrs. Zimmerman, sent a flutter through her chest. She realized with a start that she was attracted to this cowboy, this kind, steady man who had saved her life and asked for nothing in return. On the ride back to the ranch, Julia found herself sitting closer to James than necessary. When the wagon hit a rut, she grabbed his arm to steady herself and did not immediately let go. James did not seem to mind. If anything, he guided the horses more carefully, as though trying to avoid any more bumps that might startle her. As the ranch came into view, Julia felt a strange reluctance for the day to end. She had enjoyed being alone with James, away from the busy ranch where there were always other people around. "Thank you for taking me to town," she said as James helped her down from the wagon. His hands lingered on her waist a moment longer than necessary, and she did not step away. "Anytime," James said softly. "I enjoyed the company." They stood there for a moment, close enough that Julia could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, could smell the clean scent of soap and leather. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement of attraction, of possibility. Then Samuel called out from the barn, breaking the moment, and James stepped back. "I should help unload your things," he said, his voice slightly rough. That night, as Julia lay in bed, she thought about James Peterson and the unexpected feelings growing in her heart. She had loved her husband, but it had been a quiet, comfortable love. What she felt beginning with James was different, more intense, more uncertain. It frightened her and thrilled her in equal measure. Over the next few weeks, Julia and James found themselves drawn together repeatedly. They took rides around the ranch so James could show her the property. They sat together at meals, their conversations flowing easily. They worked side by side when James helped with repairs around the house. Every interaction deepened Julia's feelings, and she began to see signs that James felt the same way. He looked for her when he came in from the fields. He found excuses to be near her. He listened when she talked about her past, about her dreams, about the person she wanted to become. And slowly, Julia found herself opening up in ways she had not with anyone, not even her late husband. One evening in mid-September, when the air had begun to cool with the approach of autumn, James asked Julia to walk with him after supper. They strolled past the corrals and up a small hill that overlooked the ranch and the valley beyond. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the mountains stood dark against the brilliant colors. "It is beautiful here," Julia said, hugging her shawl around her shoulders. "It is," James agreed, but when Julia glanced at him, he was looking at her rather than the view. Her heart began to race. "James, I need to tell you something." "I need to tell you something too," James said, turning to face her fully. He took a deep breath as though gathering courage. "Julia, I know you have only been here a short time, and I know you are still grieving your husband, but I cannot keep pretending that I do not have feelings for you. From the moment I saw you standing beside that broken wagon, so determined and brave even though you were terrified, I felt something. And every day since, that feeling has grown stronger." Julia's breath caught. "James, I feel the same way. I did not expect this. I did not think I could feel this way again. But you have been so kind, so patient, so good to me. When I am with you, I feel safe and happy in a way I have not felt in so long." James stepped closer, reaching up to gently cup her face with his calloused hand. "I want to court you properly, if you will let me. I want to give you time to be sure of your feelings. But I need you to know that I am falling in love with you, Julia Zimmerman, and if you will have me, I want to build a life with you here." Tears spilled down Julia's cheeks, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I want that too." James smiled, a broad, genuine smile that transformed his usually serious face. Then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and kissed her. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as though James was afraid of frightening her. But Julia wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the pent-up emotion in her heart. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, and Julia felt a rush of desire that she had thought died with her husband. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted. "I wish you had done it sooner," Julia said, making him laugh. They walked back to the house hand in hand, and when they announced their courtship to Margaret and Samuel, both seemed delighted but not particularly surprised. "I wondered how long it would take you two to figure it out," Margaret said, hugging them both. "Everyone else has been watching you make eyes at each other for weeks." The courtship that followed was the happiest time of Julia's life. James took her riding through the mountains, showing her hidden valleys and crystal-clear lakes. They attended a dance in Bozeman, where Julia wore her best dress, and James held her close as they waltzed. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, learning each other's hopes and fears and dreams. James told her about his childhood in Texas, about his father who had been a circuit preacher, and his mother who had died of a broken heart after losing her husband and sons. He talked about the years of drifting, of feeling lost and purposeless, until he found work at the Triple Bar and slowly began to heal. Julia told him about growing up in St. Louis, about her father who had been a banker and her mother who had been a teacher. She talked about her marriage to Thomas, about how kind he had been but how there had always been something missing, some spark that she had thought existed only in romantic novels. "I loved him," she said one night as they sat on the porch watching the stars. "But I was not in love with him, not the way I am with you. Does that make me terrible?" "No," James said firmly, pulling her closer against his side. "It makes you honest. Love comes in different forms, Julia. What you had with Thomas was real and good, and you should not feel guilty for it. But what we have is different, and that is all right too." As autumn deepened and the leaves turned gold and red, James and Julia's relationship grew stronger. They knew, both of them, that they wanted to spend their lives together. But James was determined to do things right. On a crisp October morning, James rode into Bozeman and returned with a small velvet box. That evening, he asked Samuel and Margaret for permission to propose, even though Julia was a widow and technically did not need anyone's permission. But the gesture touched them both. "You have my blessing," Samuel said, shaking James's hand. "You are a good man, James, and Julia is a fine woman. You will make each other happy." James proposed that night in the same spot where they had first kissed. He got down on one knee, opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond, and said, "Julia Zimmerman, you brought light into my life when I did not even know I was living in darkness. Will you marry me and let me spend the rest of my life making you happy?" "Yes," Julia said through tears of joy. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married in November in the small church in Bozeman, with Margaret and Samuel standing as witnesses and half the town in attendance. Julia wore a dress of cream-colored silk that Margaret had helped her sew, and James wore a new suit that made him look both handsome and slightly uncomfortable. But when he saw Julia walking toward him down the aisle, his face lit up with such love that several women in the congregation wiped their eyes. The Reverend, a kind man named Father Michael, spoke about love and commitment and the courage it took to build a life together in the rugged Montana territory. When he pronounced them man and wife, James kissed Julia with such enthusiasm that the congregation laughed and applauded. The celebration afterward was held at the Triple Bar, with food and music and dancing that lasted until after midnight. Julia danced with James until her feet ached, then danced some more because she could not bear to let him go. She was deliriously happy, surrounded by friends who had become family, married to a man she loved with her whole heart. That night, when they finally retired to the room that would now be theirs together, Julia felt nervous for the first time. She had been married before, but this felt different, more intimate, more meaningful. James seemed to sense her nervousness. "We do not have to do anything you are not ready for," he said gently, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I am ready," Julia said, reaching up to kiss him. "I want this. I want you." What followed was tender and passionate, a physical expression of the love they felt for each other. James was patient and careful, making sure Julia felt cherished and desired. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, and Julia felt a profound sense of peace. "I love you," she whispered against his chest. "I love you too," James replied, his arms tightening around her. "Thank you for taking a chance on a wandering cowboy." "Thank you for finding me when I needed you most," Julia said. As winter settled over Montana, bringing heavy snow and bitter cold, Julia and James built their life together. Samuel offered James a partnership in the ranch, recognizing his hard work and dedication. James accepted, and he and Julia began planning to build their own house on ranch land, a home where they could raise a family. Julia continued to help Margaret run the boarding house, and she discovered she had a talent for managing the business side of the ranch. She kept the books, negotiated contracts with buyers, and earned a reputation as a shrewd but fair businesswoman. In the evenings, she and James would sit by the fire, planning their future. They talked about the house they would build, about the children they hoped to have, about growing old together on this land they both loved. "You ever regret it?" James asked one night. "Staying here instead of going back east where life is easier?" Julia looked at her husband, at his strong, kind face illuminated by firelight, and shook her head. "Not for a single moment. This is where I was meant to be. You are who I was meant to be with. That broken wagon wheel was the best thing that ever happened to me because it brought me to you." James pulled her into his arms, kissing her forehead. "I used to think I was just drifting through life, that I would never find a place to belong. But then I found you and everything changed. You gave me a reason to stop running, a reason to build something permanent. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and turning the valley green. By then, Julia was pregnant with their first child. The pregnancy was harder than she expected, with morning sickness that lasted all day and fatigue that made simple tasks exhausting. But James was endlessly patient, bringing her tea when she felt queasy, rubbing her feet when they swelled, and reading aloud to her in the evenings when she was too tired to do anything else. Their house was finished in May, a sturdy timber structure with 3 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a porch that faced the mountains. They moved in on a sunny Saturday, with help from the ranch hands and a housewarming party that lasted until after dark. Julia stood on the porch that evening, watching the sun set over the mountains, with James's arms around her and his hand resting gently on her swollen belly. "Our child will grow up here," she said softly, "in this beautiful place, surrounded by people who care about us." "I cannot imagine anything better." "Neither can I," James agreed. "You have given me everything, Julia. A home, a family, a future. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know how much I love you." Their son was born in late July during a thunderstorm that shook the house. The labor was long and difficult, but James never left her side, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement even when Julia was sure she could not endure another moment. When the baby finally came, his cries loud and healthy, James wept openly. "A son," he said in wonder, cradling the tiny, red-faced infant with infinite gentleness. "We have a son." They named him Jonathan Samuel Peterson, after James's father and the man who had given them both a chance. Little Jonathan had his father's green eyes and his mother's determined expression. And from the moment he was born, he wrapped both his parents around his tiny fingers. The first year of Jonathan's life was exhausting and wonderful. Julia discovered that motherhood came more naturally than she had expected, while James proved to be a devoted and surprisingly competent father. He would walk the floor with Jonathan for hours when the baby was fussy, singing soft Texas lullabies his mother had taught him. He changed diapers without complaint and learned to heat bottles to exactly the right temperature. As Jonathan grew into a chubby, happy baby who laughed easily and slept reasonably well, Julia and James's love for each other deepened. They were partners in every sense of the word, sharing the work of the ranch and the care of their son equally. They supported each other through difficult times and celebrated victories together. The ranch prospered under the partnership between Samuel and James. They expanded their herd, built new outbuildings, and earned a reputation for producing some of the best cattle in Montana Territory. Julia's business acumen proved invaluable, and she became known as someone who could negotiate a fair deal and keep accurate records. When Jonathan was 2 years old, Julia became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and in April of 1879 she gave birth to twin daughters they named Jennifer and Jane. The twins were identical in appearance, but completely different in personality. Jennifer was quiet and thoughtful, while Jane was loud and adventurous. James was delighted with his daughters, though he joked that he was now hopelessly outnumbered by females. He proved to be just as devoted to the twins as he had been to Jonathan, spending hours playing with them and telling them stories about the ranch and the land they lived on. As the children grew, so did the ranch. Samuel Hartford passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1881, leaving his share of the ranch to James and his portion of the boarding house to Margaret. Margaret continued to run the boarding house with Julia's help, and the two women became as close as mother and daughter. James became sole owner of the cattle operation, and under his management, the Triple Bar grew into one of the most successful ranches in the territory. He hired good men, treated them fairly, and earned their loyalty and respect. He taught Jonathan how to ride and rope, how to read the weather and the land, and how to treat animals and people with kindness and respect. Julia thrived in Montana in a way she never had in St. Louis. She loved the wildness of the land, the close-knit community, the sense that she was helping to build something lasting. She became involved in founding a school in Bozeman, using some of her inheritance money to help pay for a building and a teacher. She organized charity drives for families in need and helped newcomers get established, remembering how lost she had felt when her own wagon broke down. The years passed quickly, marked by the rhythms of ranch life. Spring brought calving season and branding. Summer meant long days of mending fence and moving cattle to summer pasture. Fall brought the roundup and the sale of cattle. Winter was for maintenance and planning, for family time and storytelling around the fire. Jonathan grew into a serious, responsible young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did. The twins were inseparable, exploring every corner of the ranch and getting into mischief that often made their parents laugh, even as they tried to discipline them. In 1885, when Montana became a state instead of a territory, the whole family rode to Bozeman to celebrate. They watched the parade, attended the dance, and listened to speeches about the future of the state. That night, as they rode back to the ranch under a sky full of stars, Julia thought about how much her life had changed. She had arrived in Montana broken and alone, fleeing from family who had betrayed her, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a few belongings. Now she had a husband she adored, 3 healthy children, a successful business, and a place in a community that valued her. The scared, desperate woman standing beside the broken wagon felt like a different person entirely. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, reaching over to take her hand. "How lucky I am," Julia said simply. "How different my life might have been if you had not found me that day." James smiled, the same warm, genuine smile that still made her heart flutter after 10 years of marriage. "I am the lucky one," he said. "You gave me a reason to stop drifting and start living." As the children grew older, Julia and James made sure to carve out time for themselves. They took long rides through the mountains, picnicked beside mountain lakes, and sometimes escaped for a night to the hotel in Bozeman, leaving the children with Margaret. These stolen moments of romance kept their relationship strong and reminded them why they had fallen in love in the first place. There were hard times, too. A harsh winter in 1886 killed much of their herd, and they had to rebuild carefully over the following years. Jennifer fell seriously ill with pneumonia when she was 8, and for a week Julia and James barely slept, taking turns sitting beside her bed. But Jennifer recovered, and the relief Julia felt made her realize how much she had to lose. "I could not survive losing you or the children," she told James one night after Jennifer was finally out of danger. "You would survive," James said, holding her close. "Because you are the strongest person I know. But you will not have to find out, because I plan on all of us living to be very old and very gray." The children eventually grew into young adults with their own dreams and plans. Jonathan took over more and more of the ranch management, working side by side with his father. He married a local girl named Sarah Wilson in 1895, and they built a house on the far side of the ranch property. The twins were harder to predict. Jennifer surprised everyone by deciding to become a teacher, attending normal school in Helena, and returning to teach at the Bozeman school Julia had helped found. Jane, true to her adventurous nature, married a railroad engineer and moved to Butte, though she visited often with stories about her exciting life in the mining town. As Julia and James grew older, they found themselves looking back on their life together with satisfaction and joy. They had built something lasting, not just in the ranch and the businesses they owned, but in the family they had raised and the community they had helped shape. On a warm summer evening in 1900, Julia and James sat on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the mountains just as they had done countless times before. They were both in their 50s now, their hair streaked with gray, their faces marked by years of sun and wind. But when James took Julia's hand, the connection between them was as strong as it had been the day they married. 25 years, James said softly. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I found you beside that wagon, and sometimes it feels like we have been together forever. Both things are true, Julia said, leaning against his shoulder. Time is strange that way, but I would not change a single moment, James. Even the hard times were worth it because we faced them together. Do you remember what I said to you that day? James asked. When I found you. Julia smiled. You said, climb on, I know a place where you will be welcome. And I brought you here, James said, but I did not know then what I know now. I did not know that this place would become home not just because of the ranch or the people, but because you were here. Wherever you are, Julia, that is where I am welcome. That is where I belong. Julia turned to kiss him, this man who had saved her life and then made it worth living. I love you, James Peterson. I have loved you for 25 years, and I will love you for however many years we have left. And I love you, Julia Peterson, James replied. You took a chance on a cowboy who did not know what he was looking for until he found you. You made me whole again. They sat together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the land they loved and the life they had built together. Inside the house, they could hear the sounds of family visiting, laughter and conversation drifting through the open windows. Jonathan and Sarah were there with their 3 children, and Jennifer had come for supper with stories about her students. Julia thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the broken wagon and the desperate fear and the moment when a stranger had offered his hand and promised her a place where she would be welcome. She had not known then that she would find not just welcome but love, not just safety but home. The Montana night settled around them, vast and beautiful and full of stars. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and cattle lowed softly in the pastures. The air smelled of sage and grass, and the faint smoke from the evening fire. This was her life, Julia thought with profound contentment. This wild, beautiful, sometimes harsh but always honest life. This man beside her who had shown her what true partnership meant. These children and grandchildren who carried forward the best of both of them. This land that had tested her and shaped her and finally accepted her as its own. She had come west broken and alone, fleeing from betrayal and grief. She had found salvation in the form of a cowboy with kind eyes and a steady hand, a man who had seen past her desperation to the strength beneath. Together, they had built something lasting, something beautiful, something worth every hardship and sacrifice. No regrets. James asked softly, as though reading her thoughts. Not a single one, Julia said, and she meant it with her whole heart. This is exactly where I was meant to be. They sat together as darkness fell completely, wrapped in each other's arms and in the life they had created together. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of wildflowers and the promise of another Montana sunrise. And Julia knew, as surely as she knew her own name, that she had found her place in the world at last. Inside, someone started playing the piano, and voices rose in song. James stood and extended his hand to Julia, pulling her to her feet. "Dance with me," he said, and she laughed and let him sweep her into a waltz on the porch under the stars, just as they had danced on their wedding day 25 years before. The music drifted out into the night, and they danced, These two people who had found each other against all odds in the vast Montana wilderness. They danced as they had lived, together in perfect harmony, each supporting the other, each making the other stronger. This was the life Julia had never dared to dream of, the love she had not known existed, the home she had been searching for without knowing it. And it had all started with a broken wagon, a desperate prayer, and a cowboy who had stopped to help a stranger because it was the right thing to do. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and challenges. Jonathan and Sarah had 2 more children, giving Julia and James 5 grandchildren in total. The twins remained close despite Jennifer being in Bozeman and Jane in Butte, and both gave their parents more grandchildren to love and spoil. The ranch continued to prosper, becoming one of the largest and most respected operations in Montana. James trained Jonathan carefully in every aspect of running the place, and eventually, Jonathan took over day-to-day management, allowing James to take a more advisory role. Margaret Hartford lived to be 82, sharp-minded and active until the end. When she passed away peacefully in 1903, both Julia and James mourned her deeply. They gave her a funeral that celebrated the life of a woman who had shown kindness to countless travelers and strangers, who had built a community through her generosity and warmth. Julia took over full management of the boarding house, running it until 1910, when she decided she wanted to spend more time with her growing family. She sold it to Annie, who had worked alongside her and Margaret for decades, and who promised to maintain the same spirit of welcome and kindness. As Julia entered her 60s, she found herself increasingly involved in community work. She helped establish a library in Bozeman, served on the school board, and advocated for women's suffrage. When Montana women gained the right to vote in 1914, Julia was first in line at the polling place, with James proudly accompanying her. "I never doubted you could change the world," James told her that day, watching her cast her ballot with tears of joy in her eyes. "I could not have done any of it without you," Julia replied, taking his hand. "You believed in me when I did not believe in myself. You gave me the freedom and support to become whoever I wanted to be." Through it all, their love remained the constant center of Julia's life. James was her partner, her best friend, her greatest supporter. They had weathered every storm together, celebrated every victory together, and built a life richer than either of them could have imagined. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1915, with a huge party attended by what seemed like half of Montana. Their children and grandchildren were there, along with friends from across the state, ranch hands past and present, and townspeople from Bozeman who remembered Julia's many contributions to the community. Speeches were made praising both Julia and James for their generosity, their integrity, and their love for each other. But the moment Julia treasured most came at the end of the evening when she and James were alone on their porch, the sounds of departing wagons and automobiles fading into the distance. 40 years, James said, shaking his head in wonder. "Sometimes I cannot believe I got so lucky." "We both got lucky," Julia corrected. "We found each other when we both needed saving." "I suppose we did," James agreed. He was 70 now, his hair completely white, his face deeply lined by years of sun and wind. But his green eyes were as clear and kind as they had been the day he found her beside that broken wagon. "And I would do it all again, every moment, just to end up here with you." Julia felt tears prick her eyes. After 40 years, he could still make her cry with his simple, honest expressions of love. "So would I," she whispered. "You are still the best thing that ever happened to me, James Peterson." They sat together in the darkness, holding hands, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch at night. This life, this love. This place had become so deeply a part of who they were that Julia could not imagine existing anywhere else, or with anyone else. The war in Europe seemed far away from their Montana ranch, though they followed the news anxiously and worried about the world their grandchildren would inherit. But here, in this moment, there was peace and love and the satisfaction of a life well lived. As Julia grew older, she found herself thinking often about the journey that had brought her to this place. The broken wagon that had seemed like a disaster had been a gift. The loss and fear and desperation had led her to exactly where she needed to be. And the cowboy who had stopped to help a stranger had become the love of her life, her partner through 4 decades of joys and sorrows. In 1918, when the Spanish flu swept through Montana, their family was not spared. Julia and James both fell ill, and for a terrible week their children feared they would lose both parents. But they had always been fighters, and they recovered, though it took months before they regained their full strength. "I am not ready to leave yet," James told Julia as they convalesced together. "I have more years with you to enjoy first." "Good," Julia said, holding his hand, "because I plan on keeping you around for a long time yet." True to their word, they recovered fully and continued their life together. They slowed down, certainly. James no longer worked the ranch directly, leaving that to Jonathan and his sons. Julia spent more time with her grandchildren, passing on stories of the old days and teaching them to read and appreciate learning. But they still took their evening walks around the property, still sat on the porch watching sunsets, still danced in the kitchen when the mood struck them. The passion of youth had mellowed into something deeper and more enduring, a love that had been tested by time and trouble and had only grown stronger. On a cool September evening in 1920, Julia and James sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. James was 75 now, Julia was 72, and they had been married for 45 years. They were surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, celebrating the end of harvest season with a family dinner. As the sun set, painting the mountains in shades of orange and purple, James pulled Julia close. "Look at what we built," he said softly, gesturing at the family gathered around them. "Look at what came from a chance meeting beside a broken wagon." Julia leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. "It was never chance," she said. "It was meant to be. You were meant to find me, and I was meant to find you." Everything that happened, all the pain and loss that brought us both to that moment, it was all leading us to each other. "I believe that," James said. "I have to believe it, because otherwise how could I have gotten so impossibly lucky?" They sat together as darkness fell, their family's laughter and conversation creating a warm backdrop to their quiet communion. And Julia felt, as she had felt so many times over the past 45 years, that she was exactly where she belonged. The moon rose over the mountains, full and bright, illuminating the land they loved. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled and cattle shifted in the pastures. The Montana night wrapped around them like a familiar blanket, and Julia closed her eyes, content and complete. She had been rescued by a cowboy with kind eyes and a good heart. She had been welcomed into a place that became home. She had found love when she was not looking for it, and that love had sustained her through decades of life's trials and triumphs. This was her story, their story, a testament to the power of kindness and courage and love. And as Julia sat there beside James, surrounded by the family they had created and the life they had built together, she knew with absolute certainty that every hardship had been worth it. The broken wagon had brought her here, but love had made her stay, and she would not have changed a single moment of the journey.